7.
Kia ora, good morning and welcome to this post-budget special on Morning Report. We're going to unpick Grant Robertson's first budget in some depth over the next half an hour. Remember, you can watch this as well as listen. We are live streaming this on our Facebook page, on YouTube, and you can also watch it on Freeview Channel 50. Well, joining me for this panel discussion this morning are Fran O'Sullivan from the Herald. Good morning to you, Fran.
Good morning.
Scott Campbell, who is a former political journalist and also runs the PR and consultancy firm Campbell Squared. Good morning to you, Scott.
Tēnā koe.
I've got with me also Sue Bradford, who is a former Green Party MP, and from Newsroom, Bernard Hickey. Welcome to you all. Thanks for coming in to discuss this with us. Let's just start with first impressions. I'll start with you, Fran. Your paper, The Herald, has easy listening as its headline, and it's got Grant Robertson with the DJ cans on, his hands in the air, mixing some tracks. But the general theme seems to be sort of trying to walk this balance between fiscal responsibility and kind of delivering for a Labour constituency. How do you think he did?
Well, it wasn't bold and it wasn't boring, but it really, to me, I think there was a comment he made in the narrative where he said that the government was turning the pages on the ideology of individualism and a hands-off approach, and I think it's anything but. I think there's an element of business as usual. Part of it, I think, also was, some $5 billion more working for families, basically announced last year. And so, in a sense, the big ticket items had already been pocketed. I think it was quite smart in that it's given them time to do a bit more thinking and a bit more policy planning before, dipping into the bag again, because they are going to have about, a considerable amount, 20-odd billion of more revenue and 24 billion of extra spending over the next 4 years. I'm quite pleased they haven't done it all in one cut.
OK, well, so that was the Herald. I looked to the other end of the country, Scott Campbell, the Otago Daily Times. More gain, but Minister too cautious is their headline on the budget. Is that a sentiment that you share? Or?
Yeah, I think so. It's Cullen-esque, I think. It has a lot of shades of Michael Cullen in there, and I'm assuming that he had some part to play in it. It was predictable. I think we've probably heard everything that was in the budget before it got there yesterday. I think he's, as Fran said, he's leaving himself a lot of room for the next couple of years, and so long as they can probably manage some of the potential fallout, like teachers, doctors, nurses potentially walking out not very happy. If they can manage that, they'll get through the next couple of years and be in a good place politically. So I think, look, it was a bit boring. I think we would have finished talking about it in the next couple of days, but I think finance ministers quite like that, though, if it's not election year. Having a budget that's pretty much that hasn't caused any major troubles is not a bad thing.
Sue Bradford, I don't think you're going to agree with this. Just at a wild guess. What did you think?
Well, I must say that this budget is a far cry from anything we would have expected under National, and that's a huge relief. Secondly, you can't judge a government by its budget alone. You need to look at the broader context, and I've been very heartened in the last couple of weeks by Jacinda Ardern and Phil Twyford talking about a new form of empathy and kindness coming from government in regards to homelessness and poverty, the areas I'm most concerned with. But at the same time, there's no question but that this budget, as Grant Robertson and Labour Greens New Zealand First just continuing the neoliberal capitalist agenda of National. They're completely constraining themselves inside the budget responsibility rules. There's no move to go past that, which is a huge disappointment when we're facing critical levels of homelessness and poverty that I now think that Labour, even though it's had all this time in government already, still doesn't understand the depth of the problems here in Auckland and throughout the country.
Well, Bernard Hickey, here, Sue Bradford, talking about those fiscal responsibility rules, the self-imposed straitjacket, if you like, that Labour knitted for itself before the election, along with the Greens. Not only are they not in any risk of breaching those, they're well within inside them.
That's right. They've given themselves plenty of room inside that box. When you look at the net debt numbers, getting down to 19%, they had targeted 20%. You look at the surpluses, $3.7 billion this year, rising to over $7 billion by 2021-22. It's almost in the same way that Michael Cullen had a problem by the end of his time in power, where he had to think about ways to give it away. Grant Robertson and Jacinda Ardern have plenty of money there. You could argue maybe they're holding some in reserve for the next couple of budgets, but the fundamental problems, the transformation that they talk about, is not delivered because they're not challenging that key limit they have, which is the 20% debt target. It's a target that makes no sense when you actually go into the bond markets and ask people, would you be worried about New Zealand if we rose above that 20% debt target? And the key measure of that is yesterday, New Zealand could have borrowed tens of $1 billion yesterday at 2.83%. That's how much our 10-year bond yields are trading at. That's actually less than it cost the American government to borrow money.
And listeners might be wondering why they did this to themselves. And I'll put this on the table. Perhaps they believe that business and maybe Middle New Zealand would have a credibility problem with the Greens and Labour, because it was the Greens and Labour who signed up to this. And so they had this heroic target, and now they have to stick to it.
Yeah, yes, I think that's one thing, the fiscal settings, but I think what business was looking for, and there was considerable support for this government, is to address the social issues, and just as much as anyone else in New Zealand, business is part of that. And so you've got that concern about housing people, about the immigration still fueling growth and fueling it very strongly for quite some time. And so those settings which are just pushing that forward, the housing crisis is still going on, and they've fallen down on KiwiBuild, for instance. They've just had to admit they're just not going to be able to build, as much as they projected. So these are big issues, and they really do need to get some big thinking there and look at how they can actually get a program of action, because to me that's really what business was looking for as much as anyone else.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I did hear a lot of that from business. People might be surprised, but business people saying, well, look, we are concerned about these issues.
Yeah.
I was going to come to KiwiBuild later. Let's bring it forward now because you've raised it. It feels like this program's coming under real stress. I saw predictions from Treasury yesterday. It would only bring on about half the amount of action that they were talking about. What do we think? Because this is a big, big issue.
Oh, a huge issue. I think it's it's the issue that if they don't manage it correctly, it's the issue that'll drag them right down at the next election. We're 6 months in and not one home has been built yet. You've got the minister running around Auckland with a couple of officials trying to drum up plans that they can go and buy homes off. And then you've got people who are sitting there saying we want to be a part of this, and they're not connecting with them. I think and now we're talking about 6,400 more social homes, and I think that's a good thing, but how are we going to build them? We can't build enough at the moment.
And remember, that's over 4 years. I think it's so it's 1,600 a year. You're very much in touch with these communities. Sue, how much impact is this going to have on this pretty acute problem?
It's just a drop in the bucket. When you look at the state housing waiting list last week at nearly 8,000 people, they're promising to build 1,600 more houses a year over 4 years. It doesn't even, if they built those houses by magic today, it simply doesn't compute. They wouldn't even meet the most urgent state housing list needs right now, much less in 4 years' time. So what they're committing to state housing, I'm far more worried about state and social housing than I am about the KiwiBuild, because KiwiBuild is so-called affordability, which people on benefits or like ordinary
You're
wages...
dreaming, aren't you?
There's just no way.
It's 650,000 for a three-bedroom house.
A comparatively educated white family like ours, my children can't buy a house. Yeah. I mean, we're all... so many people, both low and even to middle earners, can't make it into the Auckland housing market. So the affordability of KiwiBuild is a huge question anyway. But behind that, the state housing crisis and the lack of social housing of any sort is just not being addressed. And I think Phil Twyford is probably very disappointed by what's happened here.
I mean, Phil Twyford was looking to double the number of state houses that the government was going to build. They promised 1,000 before the election. We got the 1,600. That's something. But Sue's right. It is a crisis. I walked here this morning for 10 minutes. I passed 15 people sleeping in doorways. And this is a moving feast. We've got 68,000 people a year coming to this country, and we're not building the houses fast enough. The 100,000 in KiwiBuild and the plans to build extra state houses don't even touch the sides. Business in New Zealand, particularly in Auckland, is now screaming out for workers who can live somewhere close to where they're going to work. This is a crisis in the same way that Canterbury's earthquake was a crisis. We dropped our debt targets and addressed that crisis with real urgency in 2011, 12, 13. It worked. The only place in the country where rents and house prices aren't rising now is Christchurch. We should use that same urgency and sense of crisis to deal with.
So let's try and help them here. What could they have done with that money? Let's say they decided, we can borrow it, 2.8% or something, next to nothing. What could they have done with that money to address the housing crisis?
Well, they could have gone from 20% of GDP to 30% of GDP overnight, and no bond market would blink an eye.
But you still got to build them,
Well,
don't
there's
you?
capacity constraints, and I think that's the big problem we're facing here, and the same as when it comes to construction of infrastructure and all the rest. I think they've got to do something fairly bold. I would just, personally do what the Japanese did after the tsunami and just import houses at scale and put them up. But you've got to get the land, and that's one of the big issues. And that, in some ways, they might have to be quite draconian to access land in Auckland at an affordable price. In other words, just set a price. Get rid of the land bankers.
Right.
It's like going on war footing,
I
the
think
state
they have
and
to.
social housing, using every means, and with government in charge, state investment, but also supporting local government, community and tangata whenua groups to build houses as well, and go for it and say 10,000 houses a year for the next 5 years.
All right.
That would only begin to touch it.
Okay, quick final word in housing, because I need to move on to other issues, Bernard.
You really need to abolish the business cycle for housing. Set a very high level of this is how much we're going to need to build, so that all of these companies like Fletcher's and others who previously have been nervous about creating the scale and the factories and the workforces to just build thousands of houses for years after years after years, so that they are confident that they can scale up and stay there for a decade or two.
I think just very tactically, but they need to manage people's expectations. I think making big, bold promises about housing when we've got capacity constraints and the likes, they just need to be careful with that, because we are in a crisis around housing, and if we keep making big promises and they don't deliver, that'll be a problem.
I'll stick with you, Scott. The funding for Māori development, it looked pretty tiny. Right at the bottom of the budget press releases, there was $37 million for Māori development out of a total government spend of the thick end of $90 billion. And they also cancelled the increase, or didn't deliver on the increase, to whānau ora. What do you think of the way that they've approached Māori issues in this budget?
Oh, I think there'll be a number of Māori who'll be disappointed by it. Labour got back all of the Māori seats at this last election. There was a lot of promising before the election. Kelvin Davis said $20 million for whānau ora. That's not there. Not surprising, given it was a Māori Party policy and Winston Peters doesn't like it. So that's not surprising. But I think it's mainstreaming. Most of the focus will be gone into other areas, and I can understand that. I think, though, when you're looking at things like economic development, the Māori economy is one of the ones that is growing the fastest. And it's almost as if the government's saying, well, carry on and just keep going. We'll have confidence that you keep going. There's not a lot in there. I think last time around it was around 140 million. It was in one of the last budgets. So I think it'll be a kick in the guts. I think the whānau ora one in particular will upset a lot of people. And they would have been looking for more in this budget.
And there is a review of whānau ora underway by the Minister. Perhaps he felt he had to get it sorted out before he could put more money into it?
No, I think that's probably code for it's on its way out at some point. It's a policy that Winston Peters has never liked ever since the introduction of it. There's more money in the budget for litigation and deliberation of the Marine and Coastal Act than there is for whānau ora. $11.5 million going to lawyers. So I think that there'll be a lot of Māori who'll be disappointed, and Labour's going to have to manage that carefully.
You mentioned Winston Peters not liking the policy. Maybe that had something to do with it. Wow, his influence is all over this budget.
Yes, it is, and it's actually quite interesting looking at it, how it's played out, because he is against dependency in Māoridom, and I think it's actually not a bad thing when you do look at the growth of the Māori economy now, the corporations and so forth, who still all have fairly beneficial tax rates. So I think, perhaps see how they run for a while, get some more pressure on perhaps utilising the profits that occur to create more dividends back to the people. Also, obviously, in foreign affairs. And one of the things that came through to me when you look at Winston Peters' influence was looking at those projections in the budget as to what would happen, for instance, if you had a protectionist shock, in the sense that if trade issues internationally blew up, that could have a whack on GDP. So I think in that sense, the amount of money that MFAT actually devotes to the trade prosecution of keeping trading links open and actually doing more trade deals will be very interesting indeed.
Well, they did pretty well compared to your former party, though, on the money sense, didn't they? I think there's about $3 billion, the thick end of $3 billion for New Zealand First Party policies, and about $600 million for green initiatives. Now, I know you can't strictly take it on a money basis, but it does seem that the influence of New Zealand First is very, very strong.
Yes, and it's a real pity the Greens haven't moved more on the welfare and poverty end of it, where they were heading in that direction but seem to have resiled from it. And Labour itself is not taking it on, and we can see this in this budget. There is absolutely nothing on welfare or beneficiaries, despite the fact the government is, I think, beginning to understand how deep the crisis there is as well in terms of lack of incomes and the dreadful punitive way in which people are treated daily at work and income, hence the Prime Minister's statements the other day. And yet there is zero there. They haven't even met Labour's promise before the election to repeal Section 78 of the Social Security Act, which removes benefits every week from children whose mother doesn't or can't name the father, often because of most traumatic reasons. Those families are still being penalised every week. It would cost $25 million to remove that sanction. They put $100 million into the America's Cup and don't remove the sanction on those 17,000 children.
Were you expecting that to happen in the budget?
I was
or were you
certainly hoping it would happen because it was a Labour promise, and I thought if nothing else on welfare, this is tiny compared to what's needed in terms of raising welfare levels, changing the whole culture of work and income, training and supporting work and income staff to treat people properly and with respect. There's so much good stuff they could do in welfare, some of it not costing very much, and yet there's nothing here. And you see $100 million for the America's Cup, you see over $3 billion in the surplus. They're boasting about it, not seeming to understand at all what's happening for people's real lives on the streets around this country right now in terms of homelessness and poverty, or understanding from a fiscal point of view the downstream costs in education, health, addictions, mental health, prisons, and the rest of it that comes from generation after generation of kids growing up like this.
Bernard?
And when you look at the employment side, the unemployment side, one of the big surprises out of this budget is how little unemployment drops in the next 4 years, even with what seems like a lot of spending.
It's pretty low, isn't it?
But so you go from 125,000 people unemployed to, at its very low point, 117,000. So, we're looking at a reduction in unemployment of 8,000 people over the next 4 years when you're increasing spending. And unemployment only goes down to 4.1% in this set of forecasts. Now, the government itself had its own target of getting it below 4%. So they've ticked all the boxes on fiscal responsibility, on a lot of the spending forecasts, but the core issue, getting unemployment down below 4%, getting rid of this scourge of unemployment and underemployment is not achieved here. Now, that's not just the government's issue. The Reserve Bank should be involved here as well. But they're not pushing hard enough on the accelerator to get down below that 4%.
Just a few minutes left, maybe 3 or 4 minutes left at the max before we wrap up. So I want to finish on the politics of it, because in some ways it's as much a political document as an economic one. And Fran, I wonder whether, as Scott alluded to at the beginning, whether, much in the same way as Michael Cullen was trying to do when he took over, this was Grant Robertson trying to burnish his fiscal credentials. He didn't need to play to the gallery, to the Labour base. He needed to try and say, I am a responsible finance minister. He needed to tell his ministers as much that I'm the guy who can say no. He needed to show the business community that he could stick to his fiscal targets and produce a surplus. So do you think that was probably his motivation and perhaps his success, if there was one?
Well, I'm not sure. He's still got to deal to that issue in business, which is that lack of confidence that's happening out there. And as we said earlier in the program, it's those key issues around housing, being able to pay your workers in Auckland enough to actually service debt and rents and all the rest. He's going to start going out and touting that around business fairly soon, the elements of the budget. But I think he should be looking to them to try and embrace them and bring them into a program of action, because you can say with all the will in the world that it should all come down to ministers and Reserve Bank and all the rest. But in actual fact, it needs business to get up and engage and to be very involved in building this economy. I think he really does need to take them with him on his...
Well, Scott, are they taking you with... I mean, you've got a business, you employ, 12 people or more?
Yeah, 14 people.
Okay, so...
Look, for me, there wasn't a lot in there to say that there's a lot of confidence coming. But on the flip side of it, there's not a lot in there that's going to take it away from me. I think we'll keep a close eye on how they implement the budget and what comes from here. For me, I think it was a budget of lost opportunities, really. There's probably a lot of people out there thinking, well, I might have expected more from this, and we're going to talk more about what's not in the budget rather than what's in the budget. Grant Robertson talked about it being transformational. I don't think it is. It's the blame budget. Who else can we blame to try and
You blame the last lot.
to
is the
blame the
rule.
last lot.
But and this is a trilogy, right? He's got 3 to deliver. So the first one, he wants to string out his story until he hits the big finale. That's pretty much it, isn't it? In election year.
Yes, but I think they're crazy to ignore the real crisis in the areas that I'm talking about, and undoubtedly other areas like mental health as well, where I can't see anything there. That's another hugely critical
There was some
area.
talk about this free 18 to 25. It was a pilot, though, I think, for free mental
But
health
that's,
care.
which is, I think, a green initiative, which is great. But then at the same time, they're taking 100 million out of mental health that was kept for mental health and putting it back into the general health pool. That's the sort of thing that happens over and over again for mental health. I don't get it. When we have also, alongside homelessness and poverty, a huge mental health crisis. So really, where are their priorities? Are they so burnt by the experience of 2000 when the business winter of discontent happened? Is that what is in behind this? That somehow that's all they're caring about, rather than understanding in any real way what's really going on for so many New Zealanders.
And the final word, I think it will be to you, Bernard.
This is the biggest missed opportunity in a generation. It will take a decade to get this infrastructure going to solve our problems, and they're now going to waste 2 or 3 years earning the right to go to the next election to say this is what we need to do. It should have been done this year.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks very much. Bernard Hickey, Sue Bradford, Scott Campbell, Fran O'Sullivan unpicking the first budget delivered by Grant Robertson last night. That's us on the budget for now in Auckland. Back to you in Susie Wellington. Back to you in Wellington, Susie.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Guyon. It's 28 minutes to 8 on Morning Report. Coming up before 8 o'clock, National's Amy Adams gives us her view of the budget. Also, a big eruption in Hawaii sends volcanic ash 9,000 metres into the air.